I want to thank everybody for coming here tonight. I know it's not our normal night. We've got a special guest here. And this is his only chance, and I wasn't going to say no when he asked me if he could come down here and talk to you guys. So I appreciate you coming out. I want to say a special thank you to my wife, because she knows how to read instructions. I think we worked about 30 minutes trying to get this camera to recognize the PC, and she read the instructions, and voila. So it was awesome. Anyhow, I want to again thank y'all for coming out tonight. I am David Kelly, the president of Liberty First, and I am rebellious by nature and always politically incorrect. So with that, we're going to do a toast, as we always do. Everybody has the glass, yes, no, except for Dennis. You dry? Okay.
Charles, here's my margarita.
Charles, all right. To liberty!
Long may it live!
Long may it live, absolutely. Although we're missing a hell of a lot of it, that's why we get together and talk about it. I'm not going to do a disclaimer tonight, because I trust that everything that Mr. O'Toole is going to talk about tonight is the absolute truth. Absolutely. And that everything that comes out of my mouth will be the same, as always. If you notice on the back table there, I do have a donation jar. Donations are appreciative, so I can buy this fine Chinese-made equipment with great instructions that only women will read. So, with that, I also have a sign-in book. And I also am selling Liberty Tree wine that will come out in, it's fermenting now. I have Malbec and Chardonnay, and that will be available into September for the holidays. We'll probably have a little gathering when I have more of it, but if you'd like to pre-order, it's $25 donation. Otherwise, it's $30 when I have it bottled in my awesome Liberty Tree wine label. And if you'd like to become a member, and since we're a Liberty Group, membership is not mandatory. It's only by choice. We're about freedom of choice. If you'd like to be a member and help support us, I also have membership applications in the back. And that will help get you into special events when I do bring back the Radical and Barnhart. So tonight, the main reason you all came here, because it sure wasn't to listen to me.
If she comes back, I want to.
Yeah, it was? Or actually, just a few that decided to do
this
that.
time I'm going to talk to her.
That's right. We have a number of things here. Anyhow, tonight, Randal O'Toole is a Cato Institute Senior Fellow who has written 3 books and numerous papers on transportation, which I've had the luxury of listening to Randal talk about the driverless car. It's what, less than $50? Modern cars to equip them, something like that?
Well, we'll see.
We'll see. but it's basically an inexpensive change, and the technology is there, folks. What a great presentation he did on the transportation, talking about the ugliness of rail systems and so forth. He's also written about urban growth and public land issues, including the best laid plans, how government planning harms your quality of life, your pocketbook, and your future. He resides in Oregon. I'd like to give the floor here to Randal O'Toole, who's going to talk about his new book and give us a presentation on American Nightmare, how government undermines the dream of home ownership, and I'm sure he's going to talk about some positive things too, folks. Randal.
Okay, I think it's working. Guess we had to warm up. It didn't seem to be working. Maybe you had to turn it on?
Turn it up.
Okay, turn it up. Okay. Well, I'd say I'm glad to be here, but I didn't know you were going to do a trial run of global warming. If I had known, I would have rescheduled to a cooler time of year, like mid-August or something. I've had an interesting week. I was in Washington, D.C. last Thursday and went home to Oregon on Thursday night, and then flew to New York yesterday, and day before yesterday, and then flew here last night. Going to Denver tomorrow, going to Seattle on Friday, and then I might get back home for a short time before I go down to Ventura, California. All for different reasons. Some of them related to this book, but some of them for other reasons too. I got interested in home ownership issues in the late 90s when I started working on land use regulation, and but it really became a premier issue when the financial crisis hit, and everybody blamed it on housing, and a lot of people blamed it on evil subprime mortgage lenders, evil bankers, evil Federal Reserve, evil Community Reinvestment Act. All these other issues were blamed, or all these other players were blamed for the financial crisis, for the housing bubble. And I knew that that wasn't true. So I decided to write a book on the subject, and in particular to look at home ownership over the years and see, is home ownership really something worth aspiring towards? Is home ownership something good for society? Is it worth subsidizing? Is it something that we should worry about at all? Well, after the crisis, we started hearing and seeing all kinds of articles saying we shouldn't have home ownership. That shouldn't be a goal. Home ownership has let us down, said Time magazine. The American dream is dead. And my former hometown of Portland, Oregon is, as usual, one of the leaders in this war. In 1995, or actually 1993, planners in Portland noted that 2/3 of the families in the Portland area lived in single-family homes. They set as a target to reduce that to 40%. So 25% of the people who would rather live in single-family homes were going to be forced to move to apartments, condos, some kind of multi-family housing. Now,
How can they do that?
Why?
I'll show you how they do it, and I'll talk a little bit about why they do it.
I wouldn't do it.
But this is really, it isn't just Portland, it's a national movement. It's Dr. Cog in Denver, it's Boulder's plans, it's California, Hawaii, Florida, states all over the country are adopting these kinds of rules. Now, war on single-family homes is a war on home ownership, because 17 out of 20 single-family homes in this country are owner-occupied, and 17 out of 20 apartments are rented. So getting people to move from single-family homes to apartments means turning us from a nation of owners to a nation of renters. Now, I looked at the literature to see, is home ownership valuable? And it turns out it is valuable. It's mainly valuable to the occupants. One of the big values is that children in homes that are owned will do much better in school than children in homes that are rented. And it's especially true for lower income children. It's not true for the top 1%. It's true to some degree for middle income people, but it's especially true for lower income people. If you want low income families to do well in school, their children to do well in school, then it's better for them to be in owned homes. The researchers who have looked at this have looked at all kinds of different variables, and they've concluded that it's a causation. If you don't have high home ownership rates, you have lower rates of small business formation. And those small businesses, a lot of them grow up into big businesses. And he noted that as recently as a couple hundred years ago, home ownership was very rare. In fact, if we go back before the American Revolution, probably less than 1% of people in history owned their own homes. And throughout the world, there were very few places that had high home ownership rates. One of those places was England in the first millennium after Christ. England did have probably not 60% home ownership rates, but maybe 20 or 30% home ownership. In other words, people owned the homes and the land that they lived on and worked on because the Anglo-Saxons believed in that kind of thing. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, he imported the feudalistic land tenure that was common in Europe, where the king owned everything and the people owned nothing, and they rented their land from the king. And he declared all the land in England to be his. And if you had land that you thought you owned, tough luck, you now had to pay rent to the king. Well, there was one county in England, the county of Kent, that resisted this very hard, and they fought him, and he finally agreed, all right, people in Kent can own land, but nowhere else can people own land. And so Kent, as their motto, invicta, meaning victory, victorious, they were victorious over William the Conqueror in that one respect. Even in Kent, home ownership wasn't complete. Economists like to say in order to have property, you have to be able to define it, you have to be able to defend it against somebody else using it, and you have to be able to sell it. And home ownership in England, even before William the Conqueror, or in Kent after William the Conqueror, you couldn't sell the land. You had to will it to your children, usually to your firstborn son. In 1629, King Charles, the king who was most famous for losing his head in a revolution in 1649, but in 1629, he issued a grant of land to colonists, to Massachusetts. And he specifically said in this grant that the land was to be governed according to Kentish rules. In other words, he wasn't going to demand annual payment of rent if the land could be owned by the people who received the grant. Still, the American colonies retained the idea that if you own land, you could not sell it. You could only will it to your firstborn son. In a few colonies, you could will it to all your sons, but most colonies it was your firstborn son. That was called entail. And Thomas Jefferson successfully convinced Virginia to abolish entail in, I believe, 1789, about the same time the Constitution was being written. And he considered that to be one of his 6 greatest accomplishments at the end of his life. Because a lot of the land in the colonies, and in the early states, was in very large grants. For example, as late as 1840, the land, most of the land in the Hudson River Valley was owned by a handful of people who had gotten the grants from the Dutch, when New York was owned by the Dutch. And then came the fall of the communists, of the Soviet Empire. And one of the first things that a lot of the Soviet countries did is they privatized their land and their housing. And so today, the highest home ownership rates in the world are in Lithuania and Hungary that have like 95 to 97% home ownership. But what's also surprising is that countries like Mexico and Brazil and Spain and Greece and Italy have much higher home ownership rates than the United States. Per capita income in Brazil is only 1/4 what it is in the United States, and yet 74% of Brazilian households own their own homes as compared to just 65% of American households. Meanwhile, some of the wealthiest countries in the world, Germany and Switzerland, have some of the lowest home ownership rates in the world. So what this means is that home ownership is not a function of income. It's a function of government policies that either get out of the way and allow home ownership, or promote home ownership, or put barriers in front of home ownership. And in Germany and Switzerland, they put a lot of barriers. In the United States, we mostly got out of the way, but recently have been both putting barriers and supporting it. And some of these other countries, like Italy, there's no subsidies for home ownership. There's no mortgage interest deduction. There's no FHA with low interest rates. There's no encouraging people to have 0 down payment loans. And loans in Italy are 20% down payments. And yet, government pretty much got out of the way, and so about 71% of Italian households own their own homes. In the United States, we could see this same thing in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, America was rapidly urbanizing, and home ownership rates were much higher among working class families. The homeowner typically lived upstairs and then rented out the downstairs, so it was an extra source of income. They would also have grow vegetables in their yard and then sell the vegetables. They would have backyard livestock, and they would take in boarders in other ways. There are census records showing that people had houses, like a 1.5-story house with a basement and an outbuilding, with 5 families living in it, with 28 people, just in this one little house in the outbuilding. And one of them owned it, and all the rest of the families were renting. Of course, they all aspired to eventually own. It says a home for $100, but that's the down payment. The homes actually started at $500, And that's if you had no plumbing. And if you wanted plumbing, it cost about $1,000. So $100 was a 20% down payment to a 10% down payment if you actually got the plumbing. And this home that you see here, you can find pretty much homes that are pretty much identical to that today in Chicago. And I just got this picture off of Google Street View. And you could go around the neighborhood and find lots of homes like this. Meanwhile, middle-class families had very low home ownership rates. Working class family home ownership rates were about triple middle class family home ownership rates. Why was that? Because there's no zoning, there's no protective covenants, and if you bought a house, you didn't know what was going to happen next door. Specifically, you didn't know if a working class family was going to move in next door with noisy boarders, with noisy backyard, smelly backyard livestock, with in-home businesses bringing people in and out all the time. You didn't want to be next to that, and so they rented so that they could move rapidly if they didn't like their neighbors. Now, about this time, a man named Jacob Reese took some photographs of tenements in New York City. And they're classic photos, you've probably seen them before. Terrible living conditions. Instead of 5 families to a 1.5-story home, it might be 5 families to a 2-room house or a 2-room apartment. And they were tiny apartments, and the buildings, typically 5-story buildings, they were called dumbbells because they had these air passages in the middle to provide some light into the lower floors. But you can see it's so narrow, there wasn't much light. People would throw their garbage out the windows. There was no access to the ground below, and so it ended up being very smelly, very hot in the summers. And but people in New York had to live in these high densities because they had no mechanized transportation. Working class people couldn't afford streetcars. They couldn't afford to own horses, so it was foot travel only. And a lot of factories in New York would have 4,000 or 5,000 people working per acre. And so you had to get 4,000 or 5,000 people within walking distance of that work. So at the end of the 19th century, the middle class, alerted to the living conditions in New York City in these tenements, had 2 big questions on their mind. First of all, how can we help these poor working class people who are living in these terrible tenements, which, as I say, were not really found anywhere else except New York? How can we help them achieve the American dream of living in their own homes, better housing? And second of all, how do we make sure they don't move next door to us? J.C. Nichols, who did a lot of developments in Kansas City, and he discovered that if he put protective covenants on the neighborhood, that he would get a lot more for the lot. And it didn't cost anything to put a protective covenant on it. You could make more money from it. So he would advertise that this tract is exclusive and restricted. You couldn't build a house that cost less than $5,000. And at a time when working class people were living in houses that cost $500, they obviously couldn't afford a $5,000 house. That kept blacks out, it kept other minorities out, not because there was a racial restriction, but because they didn't earn the income to be able to afford to live in those neighborhoods anyway. The problem with protective covenants is they only apply to new developments. What do we do about existing developments that may have middle-class families living in them today? So somebody invented zoning. Zoning was a deliberate attempt to force working-class neighborhoods to meet middle-class standards. Early zoning codes typically ban borders. They typically ban backyard livestock. They typically ban in-home businesses. They typically, in other words, took away all the things that made home ownership valuable to working class families. And so they would zone the city and force working class families to move out of the city if they were going to live in a home that they owned. And since they didn't have transportation, that was a big problem. What the middle class didn't expect was that in 1913, Henry Ford developed the moving assembly line that allowed him to double worker pay and cut the price of his Model T Fords in half. And the moving assembly lines required lots and lots of land. So as other industries adopted moving assembly lines, factories that were once downtown and required thousands of people to live within walking distance moved out to the suburbs and required people to get there by mechanized transportation because they were so spread out and had so many employees, and the employees were spread out, that the employees bought their Model T Fords, they drove to work, and they could then afford to buy land outside of the city, outside of the zoned area, and put a little house on it and have working class suburbs, which started becoming popular in the 1920s. At the same time, a number of other innovations took place that made housing more affordable for the working class. First of all, in the 19th century, typically, if you wanted to buy a house, you couldn't get the deed to the house until you paid it off, because the owner didn't trust you to pay it off if you had the deed. Well, so they'd require at least a 50 or 70% down payment, which made it hard to buy a house. So somebody figured out, well, why don't we just write into the contract and you only get the deed when you pay it off? Nobody figured that out until about 1890. That made it possible to offer to sell houses for 5 or 10% down payments. And so after 1890, you saw developers and others starting to sell houses with low down payments for the first time. Another thing was that when you borrowed money before about 1890, you did not pay back the entire loan in 5 or 10 or 15 years. Instead, you paid interest on it. And at the end of the 5-year period, you'd pay interest all that time, you still owe the principal. If you borrowed $1,000, you'd pay interest, and 5 years later, you still owe $1,000. Then somebody figured out, well, why don't we have them pay a little more than the interest every month? And by the end of 5 or 10 years or whatever, they'll have paid it all off. That's called an amortizing loan. And building and loan societies, later called savings and loan societies, pioneered this. And they specifically catered to working class families so that they could afford to buy houses. Then there were some construction innovations as well. Home builders developed assembly line techniques. They weren't moving assembly lines, but they would take a development of maybe 100 or 200 homes. They'd send in crews to put in 200 foundations. They'd send in another crew to frame the buildings. They'd send in another crew to put in electricity and plumbing, another crew to put in the walls, another crew to do the paint, and then the final crew to do the landscaping. So you had different crews doing different things. That kind of specializing reduced the cost of housing. If you didn't want to buy a home from a developer, you could buy kit homes. I'm sure you've all heard of Sears homes, Montgomery Ward sold homes. There are a lot of sawmills in Michigan and New York and Oregon that sold homes through the mail. You'd get a catalog, you'd pick one out, $1,500, $500, whatever. They'd ship you a big box and it would have all the parts in it. Usually didn't have the plumbing or the electricity. That stuff you had to add yourself, but it had everything else: the nails, the boards, the siding, the roofing, and so on and so forth. That kind of faded away after the Depression, but the assembly line techniques stayed with us and were developed even further. As a result of these techniques, and despite the fact that zoning had made housing more expensive, we saw a big surge in urban home ownership after World War II. Urban home ownership went from about 40% at the beginning of World War II to 60% by about 1960. Rural home ownership has always been higher than urban home ownership, but today most people live in urban areas. In 1890, most people live in rural areas, so it makes a bigger difference today. Now, in the mid-1960s, the United States had the highest rate of income equality in its history. In other words, this is called the index of income inequality, and when it's low, it means that incomes tend to be more equal. You can see it's lowest in about 1968. At that time, housing across the country was affordable just about everywhere. You could go anywhere in the country and the average price, the median price of a home was just about twice median family incomes. So that meant if you earned a whole lot more than a median family income, you'd buy a better home. If you earned less than a median family income, you'd buy a cheaper home. But the median home was twice median family income. When you buy a house that's twice your income, you can dedicate 25% of your salary to a mortgage and pay it off in less than 10 years. If it's 3 times your income, it takes 15 years. If it's 4 times, it takes a lot longer. If it's 5 times or more, it takes 40, 50, 60, infinite number of years. So when housing is all about twice median family income, I think that means that's the right price. That's the normal price of housing in this country. Well, a sociologist who studied suburban working class neighborhoods in the 1960s wrote a book called The Working Class Suburbs. His name was Bennett Berger. And he noted that whenever a social class that considers itself superior to another social class, even if their income isn't that much higher, and in the 1960s, middle class incomes weren't that much higher than working class incomes. A little higher, but not a lot. Whenever they see another class that they consider to be inferiors catch up to them, they start inventing things to make it difficult for the lower classes to catch up. They create barriers. What was the barrier the middle class created? It was the war on sprawl. They declared that sprawl was vulgar. Nobody would want to live in a sprawled neighborhood. Of course, the neighborhoods we live in aren't sprawl. It's all demand. It has nothing to do with supply. We have to look at supply and demand to see what's going on. Houston, which has no zoning, has very little planning. Counties in Texas aren't even allowed to zone. So you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can buy land in Houston, and within 120 days you can get all the permits, build on it, and be ready to move in. 120 days from when you close on the land. So that means pretty much the supply of housing is what economists call elastic. The supply curve is flat. So no matter what happens to demand, it can go up, it can go down, it can disappear, the price of housing stays about the same. But when you put restrictions on housing, you make the supply what economists call inelastic. You steepen that supply curve, so a small increase in demand leads to a large increase in price. And a small decrease in demand leads to a large decrease in price. So we get this incredible volatility. Instead of seeing housing prices go like this, in other words, fluctuating with incomes, there might be a recession, so our incomes go down, so the houses stay at about twice median family incomes. You see some fluctuations. We start seeing housing prices go like this. And I showed you the home value to price to income ratios in 1969. Here's what they look like in 2006. Most coastal California cities, median home prices were 8 to 12 times. I was going to put San Francisco on here, but it didn't fit on the graph. It was 11.5 times median family income, which means you could take a 1,000-year loan and never pay it off, even if you dedicated 50% of your income to the loan. Portland, Boulder, Denver are pretty high. Colorado Springs, I was surprised, was almost as high as Denver. And Houston is trucking right along, twice median family income, no reason it should be any different. Despite the fact we had subprime loans, we had low interest rates, we had Community Reinvestment Act, is still twice median family income in Houston. We can look at individual housing prices. I keep meaning to change the slide and I'm forgetting. I did this show in Canada once, and so I put it in meters instead of square feet, but a 205 square meter home is 2,200 square feet. Coldwell Banker each year publishes the price of a standard home, 200 square feet, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, 2 family rooms, so on, in a neighborhood that's suitable for a middle manager. In other words, a middle class neighborhood, not a working class neighborhood. This home in 2005 sold in Houston for $149,000. It meets all these criteria, except for it's actually a little bit more square footage. By 2006, Coldwell Banker said it was worth $155,000. But then, called 2006, of course, was the peak of the housing bubble, so housing prices crashed. So by 2011, Coldwell Banker said it was $187,000. There was no crash in Houston. In Portland, that same home was worth $357,000. In Denver, about the same. San Jose, which drew the urban growth boundary in 1974 and has never expanded it, $1.4 million in 2006, but by 2011 it had dropped in half to 644,000. San Francisco hadn't dropped quite as much, about 1.4 million dropped to 800,000. So a lot more volatility, a lot less affordability when you put these restrictions in place. And here is a key point that a lot of people don't notice. We had the federal government subsidizing housing with low interest rates, with mortgage interest deduction and all kinds of other things. When you restrict the supply of housing, the subsidies result in higher housing prices. The higher housing prices push down homeownership rates. So economists estimate that almost half the housing in this country is in restricted areas. So if we got rid of all the subsidies, we would get higher homeownership rates in the unrestricted areas, in the restricted areas, and lower homeownership rates in the unrestricted areas, and it would be a wash. It wouldn't make any difference at all. And in fact, even in the unrestricted areas, it wouldn't make that much of a difference, maybe 3 or 4%. It would go from 65 to 61% or something like that. Nevada, 90% of Nevada is federally owned. And Reno and Las Vegas were growing rapidly, two of the fastest growing urban areas in America, and their growth was fed by sales of federal lands. And then, in 1998, Congress in its infinite wisdom passed a law that said, when you sell an acre of land in Las Vegas to a developer, you use that money to buy other land and take it out of the land base, so it can't be developed. So developers are frantically buying land to develop, and meanwhile, the government is buying other land so they can't develop it. And it was a losing battle, and prices, for the first time, housing became unaffordable in Las Vegas. So if we look at where housing was unaffordable, you can see pretty much every state was either a state with a statewide growth management law or had an urban area with some growth management in it. Now here's some classic housing bubbles. This is in Florida, Washington, California. You can see prices went way up and then they crashed. But if we look at the same index for states that don't have restrictive laws, this is what housing prices look like. It's almost flat. It did increase, and then it decreased a little bit, but if you notice, the increase peaked in the places that are restricted. The peak was about 2005 or 2006. The crash then caused a financial crisis. The peak in the places that had no restrictions was in about 2009 or 2010. So the financial crisis caused what declines you see. It wasn't the cause. The declines weren't the cause of the crisis. We can look at the same numbers for states. I like to look at Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina because these are very fast-growing states. People say, well, housing is affordable in Texas because no one wants to live there. Well, Houston, the Houston metropolitan area is growing faster by more people than the city of Boulder every single year. And when Hurricane Katrina hit in 2004, 150,000 people from New Orleans evacuated into Houston, and 100,000 decided not to go back. And they absorbed all that, in addition to the 100,000 a year that they were getting anyway, and no blip in housing prices at all. Yeah.
Wasn't there a housing bubble in Houston in the early 80s, like 70s, early 80s?
There was a housing price increase and then a housing price decrease, but that was a reflection of Houston's economy. It was a reflection of median family incomes. Houston's economy boomed in the 80s because oil prices were high, and then when oil prices fell, Houston's economy declined. And so the price fluctuations were simply a reflection of income, whereas the price fluctuation foreseen in the 2000s had nothing to do with income. It was all due to restrictions on supply. I just want to show you a couple pictures of homes in Houston. This is a home in a development. It's about $160,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2.5-bath house. There are developments with homes like this, 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, $110,000 for a brand new home. You want to buy a used house, this is a 5-bedroom, 3-bath house selling for $89,000 right now in Houston. This is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house, $59,000 in Houston. It's very affordable. Anybody who wanted to could afford to buy a house there. And if home ownership rates are lower, it's because people don't want to or they don't understand the advantages. Well, all of this stuff is discussed in detail in my book. I've got a couple dozen copies here. The list price is $26. I'm selling them for $20. I have to confess that you can get them from Amazon for about $17, but they won't be autographed. Also, if you want to buy an electronic version, that's about $13. But if you're interested in having a nice autographed copy, you can get one today. If you don't have $20, go to the Cato website and look at the policy analyses. Just go cato.org/policy analysis. I've written about 1 out of 6 policy analyses since I started working for Cato 5 years ago. And one of them is called How Urban Planners Caused the Housing Bubble. So you can get information, download that for free. I also have a website called The Anti-Planners. At my blog, I post to it, try to post to it every weekday, addressing both housing and land use and transportation issues. And you can reach me at rot@cato.org or rot@ti.org or rot@i2i.org. ROT at a lot of things.org. There's a couple others, but if you're, and you can go to these websites if you're interested.
So, we open up to some questions?
Sure.
Thank you. I'll let him know. Yes, thank you, Randal. Yell it out.
What does it take to get you to the Board of County Commissioners and educate them to this class right here, and Planning Commission and City Council? They need to hear this.
I'm happy to do that.
They're trying, one of the things.
I live in Oregon, so I'd like to have my expenses paid to come up here to do that, but I've done that before. I went to Board of City Commissioners in North Carolina to talk to them about rail transit recently, and have testified before lots of different boards, and not always had a big influence, but really I think educating you to go out and pressure your boards, and then maybe bringing me in to underscore it helps.
Isn't this tied to Agenda 21, where they're trying to get everybody in urban areas and control?
It does, but I have 3 reasons why I never mentioned Agenda 21. Number 1, all of these ideas long preceded Agenda 21. In my book, I show they date back to the 1960s, and in fact, some of them date back to the 1930s. So the idea that the United Nations has anything to do with this, if anything, Agenda 21 was written by American urban planners who wanted to get support for their ideas. Second, to say it's Agenda 21, to say the United Nations is involved is what's called an ad hominem attack. It's like saying, Obama supports it, so it must be bad. Well, not everything Obama supports is bad. Not everything Romney supports is good, right? So I don't think that just because the United Nations has anything to do with it means it's bad. I want to look and see if the ideas themselves make sense, and I don't think they do. And then the third thing is, you talk to elected officials and you tell them you're being manipulated by the United Nations, and they'll say, you're a kook. I've never had the United Nations come to me. And you'll get written off. So it's just not worth it even mentioning it. Even if it was true, which I don't think it is, it's not worth mentioning.
But urban planning.
Oh, 10 of those. Yeah. Okay.
Mobility and home ownership.
By labor mobility, you mean going from, yeah. The question is, what about labor mobility and home ownership? And I think what that means is people have talked about the 1% and the 99%, but if you look at the numbers, that's a very fluid barrier. The people who are in the 1% this year aren't in it next year, and then other people are in it the next year, and so on. But there does seem to be a hard barrier between working class and middle class. I define middle class as a college education, a bachelor's degree and above. Less than 30% of working age Americans have a bachelor's degree or above. And there doesn't, you hear about all these stories about people being the first person in their family to get a college education, but in general, it doesn't happen a lot. We like to think of ourselves as a land of opportunity where anybody can grow up to be president. How far back in history do you think we have to go to find a president who had a working class background instead of a middle class background? Or you have to go to James Garfield. Every president since then has come from a middle class or wealthy background.
Randall, before I give the mic over to Elliot,
I blame two parties. I blame the land use regulators, and I blame the ratings agencies who failed to understand that the housing market had changed. So they rated all these bonds as AAA because historically housing prices nationwide had always gone up or stayed flat and had never declined since the Depression. They didn't understand that these restrictions had made housing a lot more volatile, and so they rated the bonds too highly.
Sir, I thought I heard you say that you're generally, from what I interpret, on the same page as Robert Schiller, which is that housing does not change in value over the long run. Before I get to my question, I want to confirm that my understanding of your remarks is accurate.
In the absence of land use regulation, housing prices will follow family incomes. So housing prices will increase at the rate of family incomes increase. So you don't get wealthy buying a house. If you buy a house in an area that has just adopted a lot of land use restrictions, then you can get wealthy if you then sell it before the crash.
Okay, so let's assume in the absence of land use regulations, and it sounds like you're slightly on a different page than Schiller, why bother buying a house at all if the stock market, the bond market, or any number of other investments will in the long run have a better rate of return?
Well, because you aren't buying it to get a rate of return, you're buying it as a place to live, a stable place where you can raise children, a place where you have secure property rights and you know that you'll be in a nice neighborhood. If you rent, it's much harder to have that security. You'll never know if your landlord's going to say, oh, I've decided to put a shopping mall in your property and you have to be evicted. Those kinds of instabilities are a reason to have buy a house. But it's an individual decision. I don't advocate that anybody buy a house. I don't advocate that the government support housing. I think government should get out of the way and let individuals make their own decisions. And polls consistently show that 85%, 75 to 85% of people would prefer to live in a single-family home that they own with a piece of land. Right now, homeownership rates are just under 65%. I think if we got rid of the subsidies and the land use restrictions, homeownership rates would rise to about 74, 75%.
Do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's good for the occupants of those homes.
How government benefits from putting restrictions. I understand the social aspect of what you said, it makes perfect sense, but why does it benefit government to restrict where people can have homes, like that one picture you showed where to the left it was all homes and to the right it was nothing? How does that benefit them?
The benefit comes in taxation. If you've got a city boundary and you develop outside the boundary, the county gets the taxes. If you develop inside the boundary, the city gets the taxes. California didn't pass a growth management law. What they did was, in 1963, they passed a law requiring every county to have a committee consisting of representatives of each of the cities in the county that would approve all annexations, incorporations of new cities, and creations of special service districts like water and sewer districts outside of cities. And these commissions quickly realized that by refusing to allow any annexations or new incorporations, that all development would have to take place in the cities and thus they'll collect all the taxes. So they drew urban growth boundaries that were often the city limits. Often they excluded land that was in the city limits from the urban growth boundary because some environmental group wanted to keep it undeveloped. And then they never expanded the boundaries. And that just made housing very, very expensive, even though there was lots of land. The San Francisco Bay Area, for example, only 17% of the land in the Bay Area has been developed, and it's all in urban growth boundaries. And the other 83% is outside urban growth boundaries and can't be developed. So California has the highest population densities of its urban areas of any state in the country. It's almost twice the average population density of the urban areas in the rest of the country because they've packed people in. 95% of the people in California live on 5% of the land because of these restrictions. They can't raise your property taxes until you sell your property. So it doesn't raise taxes by that. Actually in California, because residential owners can't have their property taxes raised, cities regard them as poison, and they try to keep residents from moving into their cities. They try to keep densities low. But that's a different issue. A study was done comparing San Jose with Dallas, and they looked at why is housing so much more expensive in San Jose than Dallas. One was the urban growth boundary added about $200,000 to the price of every house. Second was, just because land is so much more expensive. Second was, once the city knows that you can't go anywhere else, they're going to create an onerous permitting process that takes a long time. It took Scott Adams, the writer of Dilbert comic strip, 5 years to get a permit to build one house in Dublin, California. No, it wasn't Dublin. Well, anyway, it was a little town in the San Francisco Bay Area. So in Dallas, and as in Houston, you get a permit really fast. That added $100,000 to the cost of the home. Then special development charges were $25,000 more in California than in Texas. And finally, because housing was so expensive, labor was more expensive, and that added $43,000 to the price of the home. So all these things add up and make housing a lot more expensive. And it's not just the urban growth boundary, but it all is connected. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, so you would say do away with all the restrictions?
Yes.
Then, selfishly, the price of my home drops about 60%? And
well,
I'm underwater?
That is the problem. And once we put these restrictions in, then the homeowners are so happy that their prices, their housing values have gone up, and the planners tell them it's because they live in such a livable place.
But how do we correct that?
The time to do it is now, during the recession, when prices are already low. And then what happens is, your price isn't going to go any lower, but it's not going to go back up. So if you bought and you're underwater today, you're going to stay underwater. And I'm sorry about that. It happened to me. I bought at the peak of the bubble myself, so I'm going to lose money from it too. But I think that's the best policy, is to get rid of the rules.
San Francisco or San Diego, in those areas where the prices are way up here, if you do away with all those regulations, homes are selling here, they're going to drop tremendously. So you're going to have a lot of resistance for everybody who lives in the home.
They might drop. I mean, right in San Francisco, I don't think they're going to drop a lot because there's a big cachet of living in San Francisco. But Oakland, Berkeley, the communities around San Francisco, they're going to drop. And I think they should.
And what incentives can we provide to make the change?
I think we just need to elect officials who are willing to do it. I have two indications that it's possible to do this. One is, last year, Florida repealed, the Florida State Legislature repealed the growth management law that had been passed in 1985. So that's the first state to repeal the growth management law. I think that's a great victory. Second, the high-density housing that is being built in these cities is almost all being subsidized by tax increment financing. You all know what tax increment financing is. The subsidies from tax increment financing were pioneered by the state of California, which invented tax increment financing in 1952. Well, with the election of that great fiscal conservative, Jerry Brown, as governor of California, he realized that the tax increment financing was taking $3 billion a year away from schools, and the state was having to make up the difference. And so the first thing he did the day he took office was to recommend to the legislature that they repeal the tax increment finance law, and they did 6 months later. Went through a bunch of court cases because the redevelopment districts fought it. The courts said, yep, it's over. And so California has no tax increment financing anymore. So we have 2 states, the opposite end of the country, have repealed very different laws, but laws that were all part of this campaign to pack people into the cities and prevent people from living in single-family homes.
Mr. O'Toole.
Yeah.
I lived in Santa Barbara and they put a moratorium on building, which just made everything shoot up through the roof.
Yeah.
That's kind of a monthly rate to me, everything you're saying, but does that make sense that they would do
Sure,
that?
sure, absolutely. Santa Barbara, you know, is a yuppie town, and people wanted to keep it livable. They have these great phrases, sustainable, and that means keeping other people out. And especially keeping people out who can't afford the houses that we want to, the prices that we want for our houses.
As a municipality, I'm more concerned with how my land is taken care of than with what you perceive as a property right, which you don't have.
Well, the infrastructure costs really have nothing to do with it. They like to raise that issue, but the infrastructure costs are trivial and unimportant. In fact, at least one study has found that denser areas have higher infrastructure costs than less denser areas. But the reason why they really have nothing to do with it is if you go to Texas, the infrastructure costs are all paid for by the developers. They aren't paid for by government. I can show you developments in Texas. The developers will buy 10,000 acres of land. They'll borrow money. They will put in sewer, water, streets, all the infrastructure, you know, electricity, communications. They'll put it all in themselves, and then when they sell houses, they will put a fee, assess a fee on that house for 30 years, just like a property tax, to pay off the capital cost. And so it doesn't get included in the price of the house. What we see other cities doing is saying, okay, we've got $25,000 of infrastructure costs for your house. Instead of charging you, $800 a year for 30 years, we're going to charge you $25,000 up front. So then you've got a house that you want to sell, and you notice new houses now cost $25,000 more, so you'll add $25,000 or maybe $20,000 to the price of your house. So the general level of housing affordability declines. The general price goes up. In Texas, it's spread over 30 years, and so people don't really notice it. And the developments I've seen there, and I have some of them in some of my slideshows, are just gorgeous. They've got parks, they've got community centers, they've got commercial, they have multifamily, they have single family. And if I ever had to live in Texas, I wouldn't mind living in one of these developments, and they're, as I say, very, very affordable.
Hi, sir. I have a business here in construction, and the regulations are crippling, absolutely crippling, a lot of these regulations. I think I understand that, or believe that what your answer to this is going to be, but how that factors into home prices and the supply and demand curve you're talking about. And it's, in my industry in fireplaces, there's proposed regulations that are scheduled to take effect over the next few years that will increase the average cost of a fireplace by more than 50%, which will put a lot of people out of business, but also people that can't afford it, it's just going to jack up the price. So how does that factor in?
Obviously it factors in a great deal, and we're just seeing these pervasive regulations. When Hernando de Soto wrote his book in 2000, he said he hired people to go to cities in Peru and try to get a permit to build a house, or try to get a permit to start a small business. And then he had other people go to cities in the United States and try to get the same permit. And he found in the United States you could get it in a couple of weeks. And in Peru, it would take years. You'd have to go to dozens and dozens of different agencies over and over again to get the permit. And it would take years to do it. And that was an incredible barrier. Well, recent studies have found that the layers of regulation in the United States are turning us into a third world country.
I'm going to go with a couple more questions. Elliot's got a follow-up question, I think, to what you talked about earlier. And if there's someone else has another question, I'd like to do that. John, right? I got the name right. I'm trying to try to do this, but again, I want to thank you. But here's Elliot.
Sir, you said earlier that as income goes up, the value of housing can go up in an economy. Is that because the underlying stock of housing changes in value?
Yeah.
Or because the new construction tends to be more expensive? Not in terms that the materials are more expensive, but people build better houses. Bigger houses, mansions.
It's because the median house gets better. It gets bigger, has more luxuries, wall-to-wall carpeting, granite countertops, whatever. The median house gets better. It may be that the existing stock doesn't change at all and the new stock is better. It may be that the existing homeowners remodel and improve their houses, but whatever, the median value changes because people have more income, so they buy bigger houses, they buy more luxurious houses. And so the median price of a home in Chicago in 1890 might have been twice the median income, but we're talking about little teeny houses. We're talking about a lot of houses that don't have plumbing. Obviously, we're living in much better housing today.
Generally speaking, does the problem seem to originate or have more cause at local, county, or state level? And does that vary by region and by state?
The two levels...
Where do we attack?
Yeah, the two levels that are most serious are the state level and the Metropolitan Planning Organization level. The Metropolitan Planning Organization for Denver is called DRCOG, the Denver Regional Council of Governments. I forget what it's called.
We've got a council of governments.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the level that's the threat. In DRCOG, basically all the cities got together and said, we are going to draw this urban growth boundary. We're not going to let anything happen outside the boundary to keep everything for us. Most metropolitan planning organizations have not done that unless they've been ordered to do so by the states, which Oregon and Washington and Florida did in their growth management laws. So you have to work on your cog and make sure they don't do that. Another question?
Okay, sort of a political question.
Okay.
It's been said, or I don't know how I've heard this, it may be urban legend, that Bill and Hillary Clinton said, everybody needs to have a house. Okay, other than helping them look good, how do politicians play into this to make themselves look good, or do they not understand even a fraction of this?
Well, the term universal home ownership was bandied around by Bill Clinton, I think, used the term, and the owner of other people have used it. The founder of Countrywide used the term universal home ownership, and first of all, it's unrealistic because not everybody wants to own a home. A lot of people only expect to be in the city they're in for a year or two, and it doesn't make sense for them to buy a home. But we should have universal opportunity for home ownership, and I don't think that's a problem. What we saw was in the 90s, at the federal level, we had this push for higher rates of home ownership, particularly among underprivileged groups, low-income groups, Latinos and blacks. And at the same time, we had the restrictions at the state level, and the battle between them was won by the restrictions in terms of getting housing prices higher and reducing home ownership rates. Well, I'll be around for a while longer, so if you want to talk to me one-on-one.
I want to give a huge thank you to Randal I want to thank everybody here for coming out tonight on our off week, if you will, to enjoy Randal's presentation. Again, Randal, thank you so much. He does have some books here, folks. It's a great price. He will autograph them to your grandkids, to your neighbors, whatever. Even to whoever you'd like him to. I'm sure you're going to have to do that. The county commission's $20. Also, I have the square here, folks. So if you'd like to donate to the cause, we can use your credit card. If you'd like to buy a donation, I should say, for a bottle of wine, we can do that. Or membership, would appreciate it. But this thing works awesome. I went home last time I used it and checked my email box, and it not only told me the actual charge, but it told me where it took place. And within 48 hours, it was in my bank account. This thing's awesome. So if you'd like to do that, I appreciate it. Yeah, well, I don't have those numbers. Those go obviously. Those are. It's a secure site, though, gentlemen. It really is. I'm not into that. I'm an honest guy, you know that. But again, Randall, thank you so much. If you have questions, please stick around. Randall would like to stick around. I hope to answer questions, sign some books. So thanks. We'll see you on the 26th. Bye now.